Sophie had always believed she was good at reading people. Growing up between cultures, traveling often, and adapting to new environments had sharpened her instincts, or so she thought. But as the humid Caribbean air wrapped around her the moment she stepped out of the airport, she felt something unfamiliar settle in her chest. It wasn't fear exactly, it was uncertainty. Pedro stood beside her, smiling, proud, excited. "Welcome," he said, squeezing her hand. "This is where everything started for me." Sophie smiled back, but her eyes were scanning everything: the colors, the movement, the loud voices, the closeness of it all. It was beautiful, vibrant, alive, but it was also overwhelming. "I can't wait to meet your family," she said. Pedro hesitated just long enough for Sophie to notice. That pause, though small, would echo louder in her mind as the days unfolded. The drive to Pedro's family home was filled with music, laughter, and fast Spanish. Sophie struggled to follow. She caught bits and pieces, mostly tone rather than meaning. Pedro's voice shifted depending on who he spoke to: lighter with friends, firmer when responding to his sister's texts, almost cautious when mentioning his mother. "They're very close, right?" Sophie asked. "Yeah," Pedro said, "very close." Again, that tone. Sophie leaned her head against the window, watching the scenery blur. "That's nice, I always wanted that kind of family." Pedro didn't respond immediately. "Yeah, it's nice," he repeated, though his voice didn't quite match the word. The house was louder than Sophie expected. Not just physically loud, but emotionally loud. The door hadn't even fully opened before Pedro's mother appeared, her presence commanding the room. She didn't walk, she entered, her eyes locked onto Pedro first, scanning him like she was verifying he was still her son. Then they shifted to Sophie. Everything paused. Pedro spoke quickly in Spanish, introducing her, his words slightly rushed. Sophie smiled, stepping forward, extending her hand. "Hi, it's so nice to meet you." Pedro's mother didn't take her hand immediately. Instead, she looked her up and down, not rudely, but thoroughly, like Sophie was a question she wasn't sure she wanted answered. Finally, she accepted the greeting, but instead of a handshake, she pulled Sophie into a brief hug that felt more ceremonial than warm. "Welcome," she said in English. The word was polite, the tone was undecided. Dinner that night felt less like a meal and more like an examination. Pedro's sister sat across from Sophie, her eyes sharp, observant. Every question she asked seemed simple on the surface, but layered underneath. "How did you two meet? What do you do? Do you plan to live here, or take him away again?" Sophie laughed lightly, assuming some of it was teasing. "Oh, we're still figuring things out." Pedro's sister didn't laugh. Pedro stayed mostly quiet, occasionally translating when the Spanish moved too fast. But Sophie began noticing something unsettling. He wasn't just translating language, he was filtering tone. Sometimes he softened things. Sometimes he skipped parts entirely. And sometimes, when Sophie asked what was said, he just replied, "It's nothing." But it didn't feel like nothing. By the third day, Sophie started feeling like she was missing a script everyone else had memorized. There were unspoken rules, invisible lines. Pedro's mother expected constant updates: where they were going, when they'd be back, what they were doing. When Pedro didn't respond quickly, her calls multiplied. His sister had opinions about everything, from Sophie's clothes to how she spoke to Pedro. And Pedro changed. He wasn't the same relaxed, easygoing man Sophie knew. Around his family, he became more guarded, more reactive, at times defensive, at times distant. One afternoon, Sophie found herself alone in the living room with Pedro's sister. The silence stretched. Then, casually, his sister said, "You don't understand him." Sophie blinked. "What do you mean?" "You think you do," she continued, "but you don't understand where he comes from, what he's responsible for." "I'm trying to learn," Sophie said carefully. His sister tilted her head. "Trying isn't the same as knowing." That night, Sophie sat on the edge of the bed, her thoughts tangled. "Why does it feel like they don't like me?" she asked quietly. Pedro sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's not that they don't like you. It doesn't feel that way. They're just protective." "Protective or controlling?" Sophie asked. Pedro's expression hardened slightly. "That's just how it is here." Sophie frowned. "But it affects us." It's my family, he replied. You can't expect them to change. The words hit harder than he intended. Sophie looked down at her hands. I'm not asking them to change, I'm just trying to understand where I fit. Pedro didn't answer. And that silence said everything. The tension built slowly, like pressure under the surface. Small comments, lingering looks, conversations that stopped when Sophie entered the room. One evening, things finally cracked. They were all sitting together when Pedro mentioned plans to travel back with Sophie. His mother's reaction was immediate. No, she said firmly. The room froze. Pedro tried to explain, his voice calm but strained. His mother interrupted, her tone rising, her words fast and emotional. Sophie didn't understand every word, but she understood enough. She heard family. She heard leave. She heard change. And she heard her name. Pedro's sister joined in, her voice sharp, cutting through the air like a blade. Sophie looked at Pedro, waiting for translation, for reassurance, for something. Instead, he just said, "They're worried." Worried about what? Sophie asked. He hesitated. And in that hesitation, Sophie realized something that made her chest tighten. This wasn't just concern. This was resistance. Later that night, Sophie stood outside alone, the warm air no longer comforting. She replayed everything in her head, the looks, the questions, the tension. She had walked into this thinking love would be enough, that understanding would come naturally, that she could find her place. But this wasn't just about fitting in. This was about stepping into a dynamic that already had rules, roles, and expectations long before she arrived. And she didn't know if there was space for her. Pedro joined her after a while. You okay? He asked softly. Sophie didn't answer right away. Why didn't you tell me it was like this? She finally said. Pedro looked down. I didn't think it would be this hard. For who? She asked. He met her eyes. And for the first time since arriving, he didn't have an easy answer. Sophie took a deep breath. I don't think I'm clueless, she said quietly. I think I just didn't know what I was walking into. Pedro nodded slowly. That doesn't mean I can't learn, she continued, but I need you to meet me halfway. He stepped closer. I am. She shook her head gently. No, you're stuck in the middle. The truth of it hung between them. The next few days would determine everything. Whether Sophie could adapt without losing herself. Whether Pedro could balance love and loyalty without breaking under the weight. And whether his family would ever see Sophie not as a threat but as part of the future.